Okay, guys, we're going to take a look at amplitude, midline, and range. Okay, so again, this is what standard form looks like. Midline is in the middle. Don't forget your y. Your amplitude is going to be your a value, but it's absolute value. So plus or minus d is your midline. Right at the end, it has to be y equals plus or minus whatever that number is. All right, so we're going to take a look at a question. Label the axes and lightly draw the 5 quadrantal key points. What are those quadrantal key points? So if you take a unit circle, right, you break it into quarters. Cosine is the x-axis, sine is the y-axis. Break it into quarters. What do you have here? 0, then you have 90, 180, 270, and then 360. Those are the quadrantal angles. Remember, you can look right at a unit circle. This is going to be 1, 0. This one right here is going to be 0, 1 with the axis. Here's going to be negative 1, 0. And this is a listening check because this is a typo. You're going to write 0, comma, negative 1. I'm going to change it in a few minutes. All right, so those are quadrantal angles. Now, we're looking for sine. So remember, cosine is x and sine is y. So the first value is x, the second one is y. So I'm just going to shade in all the y's so that I don't get confused. Sine of 0 is 0, sine of 90 is 1, sine of 180 is 0, sine of 270 is 0, is negative 1, I'm sorry, and then sine of 360 is 0. So that's what we're actually going to plot. So let's go ahead and label our graph. Now you can label it in degrees or in radians. I'm going to do the first one in degrees and then the second in radians. So 90, 180, what's next? 270 with my quadrantal angles, 360, and then the negative side of it. All right, then let's go ahead and graph this. Okay, so what is sine of 0? Sine of 0 is 0, so you put a point on 0, 0. Sine of 90 is 1, so 90, 1. Sine of 180 is 0, so 180, 0. This is a listening check, coloring the whole unit circle here. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and fix this error. So it was 0, negative 1. So sine of 270 is negative 1. Then last one, sine of 360 is 0. All right, so the sine curve looks like that, goes through the origin is going to be the most important thing. And then you're going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Okay, so all I'm doing is labeling the zeros. They're right there. And then now, if I was to continue this graph, what would it look like? And it's always between negative 1 and 1. All right, so the next step is to draw the midline. Well, what's the midline? Remember, the midline is that number all the way by itself. There's no number. How do I write that? 0. So y equals 0 because it is a graph. Y equals 0. All right, so what does that look like? It's a dashed line going through y equals 0. All right, now plot the values of the midlines, your zeros first. So those zeros are zeros. They don't do anything, right? Now we're going to use the new amplitude to find the other lines. What's the amplitude? 3. So remember, it's absolute value of 3. Okay, it must be positive. So what does that mean? Let's go ahead and stretch it in the y direction times 3. Well, the zeros aren't going to move because 0 times 3 is 0, right? But everything else, if it's at 1, 1 times 3 is 3. And then negative 1 times 3 is negative 3. So it's going to be to positive 3, and then back down to negative 3, and then back up to positive 3, and then back down to negative 3. So it's kind of hidden, but I'll put it up in a second. We're going to talk about the range. Your range is your minimum value to your maximum value. So the very bottom of the graph is at negative 3. The very top of the graph is at positive 3. And this is how you write it. So bottom of the graph, negative 3. Top of the graph, positive 3. And then you enclose it in closed parentheses. And if you're writing it as an inequality, you write it as an inequality with y in the middle. This is a listening check, color in range on the second example. All right, so we're going to repeat this process again. So this time it's for cosine. So we need the quadrantal angles for cosine. So split a unit circle into 4 parts. It goes 0. And now because we did it in degrees, we're not going to do it in radians. So pi over 2, then pi, then 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi. All right, and what are those coordinates? 1, 0, 0, 1, negative 1, 0, and 0, negative 1. Okay, once you have those coordinates, right, you're looking at cosine. Cosine is your x, sine is your y. So we're interested in cosine because the question is asking us about cosine. So again, I'm going to shade in my cosine values just so that I don't get confused, so I can graph it correctly. So let's graph this. Cosine of 0 is 1. So 0 is 1. Cosine of pi over 2 is 0. Pi over 2, oh, I guess I should label it. So it goes 0, just the quadrantal angles. Pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, 2 pi, and negative on the other side. All right, so back to this. So cosine of pi is negative 1. So go to pi, negative 1. Cosine of 3 pi over 2 is 0. And finally, cosine of 2 pi is 1. And we're going to repeat that same path on the other side. So you see how it's just a wave, it repeats. So I'm going to put my zeros in. There's my zeros. And then it goes negative, then positive, and it stays between -1 and +1. Okay, so it goes on forever like that. So sine and cosine are very similar rather. Only difference is sine starts from the origin and cosine starts from 1. All right, so let's talk about the midline. Midline is that number completely by itself. Remember, you have to write y equals. Do not forget that the midline is a line. So y equals +3. Okay, draw your new midline. So let's go ahead and draw it. So you go to y equals 3 and you draw a horizontal line. That's your midline, y equals 3. After that, plot the 0 values first. So where is it 0 on the graph? Go ahead and just go all the way back up and put all your zeros in the midline, because those are not going to change. Because when you multiply anything by 0, it's still 0. All right, so now we're going to plot the remaining points using our amplitude. Well, what's that? The absolute value of what's in front of cosine. Oh, it's an invisible 1, so it's +1. So really, does anything change? No, because when you multiply anything by 1, it's still 1. So it's one box below the midline, one box above the midline, one box below the midline, because the midline used to be 0 and now it's +3. Go ahead and graph it with a dotted line. That represents your new graph. So old line is a solid, new graph is a dotted line. And that's pretty much all you're doing to it. Now looking at the range, remember the range is your minimum to your max. So what's your minimum value of your new graph? Right there, it's 2. What's your maximum value of your new graph? Right there. Count it out, 4. Okay. If you're doing it as an interval, it's comma and closed brackets. If you're doing it as an inequality, put the inequality signs, and it's y because it's dealing with range. Okay. We're going to take a look at one more example, and then we're going to do the other 2 in class together. This is a listening check. Color in the word amplitude. All right, so what is the amplitude? Right in front of the cosine is a half. That's the amplitude. And it is the absolute value because sometimes it is negative. So absolute value of a half, which is a half. What's the midline? -4. Remember, you have to write y equals -4. So we're going to start off with cosine. What does a graph of cosine look like? We're going to copy it from right here. Another way for me to remember it, because it doesn't start from 0, is I imagine a wine glass, I guess is what, or a martini glass, or a glass, right? Looks like a glass to me. So I remember that, hey, it's a glass. And then I draw the glass. So it starts at 1, then goes to 0, then -1, 0, then +1. And then I repeat the same process on the other side that makes it a curve. But I always plot my zeros first and then make it a curve. But however you want to remember it, that's fine. Just remember it stays between -1 and +1. So there's my glass right there. And then I repeat the same process on the other side. So it's like I have 2 glasses. All right, so cosine is like a wine glass. That's how I'm going to remember it. It starts at 1. Sine starts at 0. All right, so let's graph our new midline. So -4 and then a horizontal line. That's my new midline. And then what am I going to do? I'm going to bring the zeros down. So all I'm doing is bringing the zeros down because remember, the zeros are not going to change. 0 times anything is 0. Now I'm going to multiply everything here by half. So instead of it being 1 above the midline, it's only going to be half a box because 1 times a half is half. So whatever the amplitude is, you're multiplying it by 1 and -1. Then dotted dashed line, and that's your new transformation. So we're really looking at what does the stretch or shrink happen in the y, because that's a shrink, and then this moves it down 4. So 2 transformations we're working on. All right, looking at the range. Now, yes, we can look at the minimum and the maximum every time, but there is a pattern to how I get it. So let's see if I can see what the pattern is. Okay, it has to do with the midline, and then it looks like if I add and subtract the amplitude, I get the answer. So that's really what it is. It's midline plus or minus. The amplitude will give me the range. You can remember that, or you can physically look at the graph. It is better if you remember, because sometimes they just give you an equation. You don't want to have to graph it out. So I'm going to look at it as normal. So it's -4.5 is my minimum. My maximum is -3.5. I'm going to use this new calculation just to check it. So let's check it using the midline plus or minus amplitude. What's the midline? -4 plus and minus the amplitude, which is 0.5. Put that in the calculator. -4 plus a half is -3.5. And -4 minus a half is -4.5. So you see, it checks out. So this works. We're going to keep using it just to make sure it works on everything. So if I write as an inequality, that's how you write it. All right, so let's practice.